Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Before I start, I just want to say thank you for all your support. I recently just got to 3,000 subscribers, and I obviously couldn't have done that without people sharing my content, subscribing, and watching my videos. So thanks a lot for that, I really appreciate it. The last two videos that I made were both about Thor, and those have gotten a lot of views, so apparently a lot of people are fans of Thor and really enjoyed that content. So in this one, I'm going to be taking a look at Jane, which is another Thor. This video is a bit late because I was covering that other content, so you probably might already have some idea of how good she is, which she is really good. And although Thor gets most of his power from the uniform and the level 80 with the T4, Jane actually gets a lot from the uniform alone and goes a little bit further with that T3. Putting her somewhere in the ballpark of level 80 Thor. Because there is a CTP unequipping event this week, I went ahead and tested both energy and judgment for Jane, and for those that are still wondering what CTP is most ideal for Thor, whether it is judgment or rage, I also tested that as well, and you can find that at the end of the video. Before I take a look at how the character does in World Boss Legend, I quickly included how the character does just at level 70, so showing you the power of the uniform alone, and then you can see the difference that the T3 makes with the uniform. The initial testing that I did was with no damage proc and a bare bones build, so I only have an invincible obelisk and have no Urus equipped and no artifact. At level 70 she can do a stage 99 of Thanos in about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then versus Knull Stage, because he is susceptible to all defense down that ignores immunity, I'm able to beat him in 1 minute and 10 seconds, or about 1 minute and 20 seconds faster than Thanos. At T3, she has about a 45-second improvement versus Thanos, and roughly a 20-second improvement versus Knull Stage, beating Knull Stage in under 1 minute. One of the benefits of the new uniform, besides the fact that she becomes amazing as a solo character, is that she also becomes a support character to characters that have the shock tag in their kit. Some popular characters that have that are Thor, Beta Ray Bill, Electro I believe has it, and I think Storm. There's probably some other ones as well, but I'm just not remembering. So for those characters and herself, she basically gives them up to 40% lightning damage and about 30% ignore dodge. Besides that, she has a bunch of great effects in her kit as well. She has crit damage and reduced damage taken from villains on her uniform passive. She has damage accumulation on her third skill. She has a damage proc and healing on her fourth skill, and all defense down that ignores immunity, and yet another damage proc on her fifth skill. To add to this, her skills hit very hard, are proc friendly, and have a lot of hits on them, with the only downside being that they have kind of a long cooldown. Regardless of that though, she is a great character specifically for PvE, since she doesn't really have many things in her kit to help her in PvP. With that said, if you're building the character for PvE, you basically have the option of either a CTP of energy, a CTP of rage, or a CTP of judgment. I only tested a CTP of energy and a CTP of judgment, and I would probably guess that a CTP of rage is maybe a little bit ahead of the judgment, despite the fact that Jane doesn't have any guaranteed crit in her kit. Between the energy and judgment that I tested, it seemed that energy was ahead, despite the fact that I even used a mighty judgment and only had a regular CTP of energy. Before I show the results of that though, you can see that in this clip, I'm still using a bare bones build with no damage proc, and I'm still able to complete stage 9 of Knull with no leadership or support, and with a good 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. Because she did so well at stage 9, I was actually curious if she could complete stage 29 using a leadership and support and still with no damage proc. Surprisingly enough, she was able to complete it with a good minute left over. For those wondering, results like that for Jane are similar to the ones I had when Makari came out and when I initially tested Moonstone. Despite what kind of build you have on the character, or even none at all, the rotation for Jane is pretty much the same. You start off with the third skill and delay cancel that after the hammer comes down or she appears, and then you go into the 5th skill, which you immediately cancel into the 4th skill, and that is essentially the skill that you want to proc on. You can potentially cancel the 1 and 2 before you go into this rotation just to build up your ultimate meter faster, but if you have a mighty CTP that might activate your top proc, so usually that's not really used. For those wondering whether the 3rd skill will activate the proc early, it does have 1 hit on it, so if you get super unlucky, I would say 90% of the time it doesn't activate early, but if it does, I would probably recommend that you still go through the rotation to fill up your ult, since that will give you the most damage on your next rotation. So leading from that, once you have your ultimate, the rotation is essentially the same, except you're going to cancel your 4th skill into the 6th or ultimate skill. Alternatively, if you find it difficult to activate the 6th skill, sometimes it can be sticky, you can do the 4 cancel, 5 cancel into the ultimate skill instead. This is the first test that I'm doing with the CTP, so for this one I'm using a mighty CTP of Judgment, and I was able to complete this stage with 3 minutes and 11 seconds left, which is a 2-minute improvement from the previous clear that had no damage proc at all. This was the other run with a CTP of Energy instead. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a mighty CTP of Energy, but this clear was only about 10 seconds or so off the other one, meaning that that can be attributed to basically just a tighter rotation. So for this, the CTP of Energy is either right on par with the Mighty Judgment or just a little bit behind it. One of the things I noticed was clearly worse on the Energy versus the Judgment was the fact that I was getting guard broken a lot, because the Mighty Judgment has that guard break immunity for 5 seconds when the type amplification effect occurs, whereas the Energy clearly doesn't unless you reforge that as well. That Knull Stage was a little bit low for Jane, so I also ended up testing on a stage 34 of Mephisto, and in this one with the Mighty Judgment, I was able to complete it in about 2 minutes or with 3 minutes remaining. In the second test with the Energy, I was a little bit further behind this time, 15 seconds or so, but again that gap isn't really that massive since about 5 seconds or maybe 10 can be attributed to a tighter rotation. Probably the clearest example of these two CTPs is in the Giant Boss Raid Dormammu. In this first one, I'm using a CTP of Judgment, again, the mighty one, and I complete the stage with about 2 minutes and 52 seconds left. And in this other one, I'm using a CTP of Energy, and I was actually able to clear it about 5 seconds faster. So between the two CTPs, an Energy does kind of outclass a Mighty Judgment, and then if you're able to reforge the Energy, it should be even way better than the Mighty Judgment. You can also see from these clear times that Jane is pretty amazing, since she's able to do Giant Boss Raid with over 3 minutes left, and even the other World Boss Legend stages with over 2 minutes left. If you are going to take Jane into Giant Boss Raid, I would highly recommend you have another character you can swap into, because a lot of her skill animations can't really be cancelled out. You usually have to use the second skill, I believe, to be able to exit the skill. And with those purple orbs going around, you usually have to swap out if those skills aren't available. So having a character like Beta Ray Bill, who is a good leadership and can also do damage, is ideal for the team. I also took her into Alliance Battle Extreme with the Mighty Judgment equipped, and was able to score almost 8 million by having to swap to Ghost Panther to do that fire damage to stop the roar. So without swapping, she could probably go over 8 million, maybe let's say 8.3 million or more, but she suffers from a lot of the same issues as Thor, which is that she has long cooldowns, and that usually leaves gaps, which are really important not to have in Alliance Battle Extreme, since you want to be constantly hitting to rack up those points. It's a little bit early to tell, but my guess would be that she won't be replacing Wanda as the universal superhero female character for that particular day. I also tried testing her in Timeline, but unfortunately this is when the big network outage occurred in Canada, so I wasn't able to test during the reset when there wasn't any buffs. And from the little testing that I did with the Guard Break Immunity and Invincible build that I have here, she didn't really do that great. She basically was able to take out some characters like Sentry sometimes, but the wind up on most of her skills is really long before the damage occurs, which usually leaves her open to get killed by a character that has iframe ignore, or if the enemy also has an iframe of their own that has higher priority, she basically just sits there till she dies. Because a lot of people were asking me what CTP is best for Thor between the Rage and the various different judgments, reforged and not reforged, I decided to unequip the brilliant CTP of Judgment that I had and see how the Rage compared in content like Giant Boss Raid, as well as World Boss Legend and other modes. My basic findings were that when you compare a CTP of Rage to a regular Judgment, it's usually better in all cases. When you compare a Rage to a Mighty Judgment, they're sort of on par, but the Rage is better in Giant Boss Raid, whereas the Mighty CTP of Judgment is better in World Boss Legend content. And then finally, when comparing a Rage to a Brilliant CTP of Judgment, the Rage is surprisingly better in Giant Boss Raid by a good amount. However, in World Boss Legend content, it's vastly inferior to the Brilliant CTP of Judgment. Besides that, the Brilliant Judgment is ahead of the Rage in all other modes by a decent amount. You can see an example of those results here. In this clip, I was able to beat Dormammu with the Brilliant CTP of Judgment in 2 minutes and 54 seconds. Switching over to the CTP of Rage, I was able to complete the fight in 2 minutes and 22 seconds, or about 32 seconds faster than the Brilliant CTP of Judgment. This is a bit of a shocking result, but I don't really think it's due to some kind of element damage cap or diminishing returns on element damage. I think it's more to do with how good one of the effects in the CTP of Rage is, namely the one that ignores boss damage decrease. You have to keep in mind that with Thor's T4, he increases that value even higher, so from 60 it goes up to 70.8 with the level 5 version of the T4, which goes even higher if you can get it to level 6. Although the CTP of Rage is better in Giant Boss Raid, it is noticeably worse in World Boss content like World Boss Legend. With the Brilliant Judgment equipped, I was able to beat stage 39 of Mephisto with about 3 minutes left, and although it's not shown here, I did some more testing after this and was actually able to beat it with 3 minutes and 30 seconds left as my best time. With the CTP of Rage equipped, the best clear that I got was with 2 minutes and 22 seconds remaining, which is evidently worse since it's a difference of 30 seconds or 60 seconds if you compare it to the clip that wasn't shown. In squad battle, I scored nearly 10.8 million with the Brilliant Judgment, and then with the CTP of Rage, I scored about 10.6 million. Although these values are close, the gap can become much larger in squad battle, I found, but of all the different times that I tested, the Brilliant Judgment always ended up giving the higher score. Keep in mind that this performance might not translate exactly in ABX since there's a lot less movement involved there, and you might not fill up that top proc to get the full benefit of the Brilliant Judgment or the Mighty Judgment there. In this patch, the CTP of Rage allowed me to clear stage 12.5 in 1 minute and 28 seconds. And then the Brilliant Judgment had a difference of 4 seconds, which again is not really much of a difference, but again, every time that I tested, the Brilliant Judgment was ahead of the Rage. So basically, to summarize, if you're wondering what CTP to use on Thor, if you're going to use him primarily for Giant Boss Raid clears, then use a CTP of Rage. Otherwise, if you want to push to higher stages of World Boss Legend, then use a Mighty CTP of Judgment at the very least. Between a Rage and a regular Judgment, the Rage will be better. If you're lucky enough to get a Brilliant CTP of Judgment and don't really care about the few seconds slower clear time in Giant Boss Raid, then probably use that instead. However, keep in mind that for most people, a CTP of Rage will get the job done very easily and you don't have to mess around with reforging CTPs. And to add to that, when the CTP of Rage does become reforged, it might end up being the clear winner in terms of performance across the board. Going back to the main topic of the video, which is Jane, I would highly recommend her uniform for anyone who wants to have a really solid PvE character, but for PvP she does kind of fall short, and I wouldn't really recommend her for that. Both of the Thors got amazing upgrades, and I try to do my best to show which CTPs you can use for the characters and how they compare to one another, and what modes they excel at. Hopefully that Jane review and some of the breakdowns with these CTPs helped you guys out, And if it did, please consider liking and sharing this with other people to help them out as well. And if you want to see more content like this and help me out, then please consider subscribing too. As always, thank you for your time and watching, but the video is now over.